running, it sends a whole bunch of JavaScript, which is what we described before, right? So JavaScript travels over the wire and eventually gets to the user, right? So the developer on the server can understand what's going on over here quite well, right? So he or she can easily instrument the functionality of the server, can dump log files, can attach a debugger, profiler, so on and so forth. Now, unfortunately, the moment that goes over the wire, that goes over to the user, or tons and tons of users on the right-hand side of this picture, that visibility disappears. This is what Emre was alluding to earlier, and this is what we would like to regain with Ajax Code. That was really the original vision with Ajax Code. Now, how do you accomplish that? Well, the key to accomplishing that is to look at what's going on here. So this is JavaScript code, right? What we can do is we can actually instrument the JavaScript code before it is sent over to the user. We can instrument this JavaScript code in any way we wish potentially, right? So we can instrument it to add additional information about timing that will give us profiling, or it can give us additional information about what functions are being used that will give us coverage information, or we can instrument it further to figure out, which events are being hit on the user side to know how the application is actually being used in the field.
Yeah. So how do we do that instrumentation?
Yes. How?
So we have basically the idea is to take. We don't want.
Great question.
Yeah. And do you want to answer it? I asked the question.
No, you can answer your own question.
I'll
Go ahead.
Question. It was a leading question.
This is not the first time.
So what we want to do is we want to be able to instrument this JavaScript and learn more about how it's behaving on the client side while having the minimal impact on basically the existing server-side infrastructure. People have already deployed these great JavaScript applications or poorly performing, not so great applications, but we don't want them to have to rewrite things. Who are we to judge? Yeah. So what we do is we basically plug in something in the middle here that's going to take all this JavaScript out, and I don't know how to, I'll just rewrite here, instrumented JavaScript. So this thing here is going to take in the JavaScript that's about to go to the client, and then it's going to go and parse through the JavaScript code, find out all the function boundaries or all the places it needs to change in order to collect the data that it needs to collect, and it's going to add in the extra instrumentation code in those spots. So this instrumentation code is going to ship out to the browser along with the rest of the web application, and it's going to have access to all of the things going on inside the JavaScript sandbox on the browser. It's going to be able to collect how long things took. It's going to be able to take a look at application state, and it can report back this information back to the server. So we're going to draw back another line here that says these are the logs of how the application is behaving, getting reported back once instrumented JavaScript runs.
So as you're talking about this, I'm preparing an example that shows how to do instrumentation. So this is kind of your right example of how to instrument things. So suppose you have a JavaScript function that looks like this. This is actually JavaScript code, right? So this is function. There are no types for the parameters. JavaScript doesn't require that. Just computes the sum of these two numbers, or actually strings. This could be strings. This is the input. Now it goes through Ajax scope, and by going through the Ajax scope would insert a couple of extra statements. So for instance, it might put a logging statement. Let's just call it log over here, and then we say, timestamp. There you go. And this is kind of pseudocode. In reality, we have to use the date function in JavaScript to actually query the current time from the browser. And at this point, we're just recording the beginning of every function. That's all we're doing here. Yeah. Now, we can actually expand that, right? So this is just a start. So suppose we're interested not only in this, but also in figuring out what parameters are being collected.
Okay.
So then we can just stuff these parameters in.
That would be interesting for security, for example.
Well, that would be interesting for security. That would also potentially be detrimental for security because, well, maybe this is some sensitive information. You wouldn't necessarily want to collect everything. Clearly, if you are just collecting the timestamp, then generally speaking, you wouldn't be sort of touching anything terribly sensitive. If this is, say somebody's credit card number, somebody's private data, then perhaps you wouldn't want to send it over to the server over perhaps an unsecure connection as well.
Yeah. But yeah, so But this can be really useful if you want to debug. Let's say like later on in the function execution, you get an exception being thrown, and you want to try and get the information that's going to tell you how the user got to that point where they put where the application started throwing exceptions. And so in times like that, this can be very, very useful.
Cool.
There's a couple of, now there's to get the performance of foo, we do also need to log the time that the function finished.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some nice rewriting we do there at the end if you want to go into that.
Well, so what will you do here? So I guess
Well,
you would write this out.
it's simple, I guess.
Right,
but
this is way too simple. But suppose you have some really clever functionality that's going on over here, right? Well, maybe this really clever functionality is basically, say, var z is equal to x plus y. This is as clever as it gets. And then you proceed to return z. This is functional the same as what you had before. And then maybe you would put another logging statement. Let me just squeeze it over here. So log, again, timestamp.
I can only zoom so much, so.
I know, but we're using color coding to illustrate what we mean.
Yeah.
At this point, it's too difficult to read, but let me just go through, let me just illustrate the point that I wanted to illustrate. So in this case, we put the body of the function between these two logging statements. We collect the timestamp initially, we collect the timestamp at the end, and then on the server, once we have both of these timestamps, we can figure out how long this function execution has taken in this case.
Actually, I want to make a point that just one little detail that we do. So we said the red is the code we're adding. So if if you're returning x plus y, maybe that's actually a function that's going to take a lot of time. It's like return some g of x of y.
Right.
Then here, what we'll do is we'll actually be the ones to insert var z equals and then return z here, so that we can make sure that the timestamp gets collected right before you return, as opposed to right before you return and then call g of x of y. So that's a little thing we do there to make sure that.
So we hoist out this variable so that this computation is properly captured.
So to be curious, so you have a tool that can analyze JavaScript and then.
Right. So what we have built, in essence, is a parser framework as well as a rewriting framework. And so basically, what you are given is an AST, an abstract syntax tree for your input JavaScript program, and you have the ability to do these sorts of rewriting quite easily, and then spit out the rewritten form of the program in text. Right. So suppose this is your input, and then this with the red stuff added would be your output. And since we are sitting here, you would send it directly on the wire without essentially breaking the flow of the application. Yep.
So I'm really curious now to see it in action. So can we? Should we move to the demo or?
There are a couple of other things actually
Yes.
we wanted to talk about in this big vision. We'll get to the demo in a second. So one thing that is interesting and somewhat unprecedented is the fact that we have actually a lot of users that we are talking to, and actually that opens up a bunch of interesting opportunities that Emre will talk about.
Sure. Okay. So good question.
Questions, a statement.
Great statement. So
you.
yeah, so I mean, if we're adding all these log statements everywhere in these functions and stuff, that's going to have quite a bit of overhead. So what we wanted to do was look for ways that we could exploit this web application environment to make sure that the user actually wasn't impacted by the fact that we were collecting all this data. So we thought that, and still think, that the key differentiator between the web application environment and a lot of application deployment environments in the past is the fact that deployments are essentially are very tightly controlled by the web server. When the web server changes something, it can be immediately reflected in the next user's experience. The next user comes in, they download the latest version of the file. If a user who's used the application previously turns on their browser and visits the site again, it can go back to the server and ask if this is the latest version of the file. So what we do then is whenever this file is being sent out to a user, we have the option of sending them slightly different instrumentation each time. So we use this in two different ways. One, we sample our instrumentation so that not every user is going to run, is going to collect every single log timestamp there. And the second thing we do is we do adaptive instrumentation. So we can, for example, start instrumenting the program at a very high level, then only drill down and collect details if we think that there's something there we need to learn more about. So, for example,